welcome to the beginning of video lessons. Thank you for being patient with me while I figured out how to be the most supportive I could be at this time. This short story is called When Mr. Pirzada Came to Dine by Jhumpa Lahiri, and it's the longest piece that we've looked at as a class, and I hope that you have gotten the chance to read it. If you haven't, I think you should pause this video and go read it first. If you watch this video first instead, you'll be okay. You'll just get things like spoiled for you that you might want to just kind of experience in real time. It's really interesting, beautiful writing that would also be just really fun to experience. So try to read it if you have the time. So I want to frame this lesson in the context of building things. And that's important for us because short stories, like all kinds of writing, are built. But short stories or novels are built just like how you build your academic essays, where you plan them ahead and you make sure that what you were saying at the beginning is still relevant to what you're saying at the end. Like, imagine that on a larger scale with a piece as long as this, or a novel that can be much longer, right? And if we think of ourselves as building, as crafting, then we might take a little bit more pride in what we're doing as writers. I'm going to pay really close attention to the opening of this story. I think that there's a lot to learn from the opening, so I'm going to go through the first page or so pretty slowly, stopping a lot, and talking through it with you. In the autumn of 1971, a man used to come to our house bearing confections in his pocket and hopes of ascertaining the life or death of his family. So there's a lot of reasons we need to look very closely at that sentence. First, we are building a setting, and setting is not just place, it's also time. Place is super important in this story, but so is time, and we know already that we're in the autumn of 1971, but it's being told in past tense, so we know that the autumn of 1971 has passed, right? And then we're also building the irony. Irony is any time that the lightness and the darkness of subject matter are contrasting. They're both present, and one of them is more appropriate than the other. And so in this case, we have confections. He's bearing two things. He's bearing confections in his pocket and the hopes of ascertaining the life or death of his family. And the life or death of your family, like, trumps everything else, right? So it's pretty ironic that the other thing that you have with you are confections, which is like an old-fashioned way of saying candies. So he has candies with him, but he's also looking for, his family's well-being. His name was Mr. Pirzada, and he came from Dhaka, now the capital of Bangladesh, but then a part of Pakistan. We're learning now about this part of the world. That year, Pakistan was engaged in civil war. The eastern frontier, where Dhaka was located, was fighting for autonomy from the ruling regime in the West. Sorry, I lost my place. In March, Dhaka had been invaded, torched, and shelled by the Pakistani army. Teachers were dragged onto the street and shot, women dragged into the barracks and raped. By the end of the summer, remember what I said about time, so by the end of the summer is a big marker, right? 300,000 people were said to have died. So that is our starting point. This has happened before we even get to the story. In Dhaka, Mr. Pirzada had a 3-story home, a lectureship in botany at the university, a wife of 20 years, and 7 daughters between the ages of 6 and 16, whose names all begin with the letter A. This is our first list, and lists are really important in this story because they build images. Lists are probably your most accessible tool that you have that you don't even know you have yet. But you're going to be grappling sometimes when you're writing with whether or not to use summary or to use something more immediate and detailed like a list. Use a list. We don't read about Mr. Pirzada had a full life in Dhaka and that's it, right? That's not as interesting. We know that he was teaching at a university, that he had a wife, that he had 7 daughters, not just children, daughters, and that all their names start with the letter A. And right away, we have a much clearer picture of what that life was than we would have had if Lahiri chose to just say, he had a good life, right? And then the very next thing we get is another really exciting tool of writing, which is dialogue. Their mother's idea, he explained, producing from his wallet a black and white picture of 7 girls at a picnic, their braids tied with ribbons, sitting cross-legged in a row, eating chicken curry off banana leaves. Very image focused right away. We can really picture that, right? How am I to distinguish? Aisha, Amira, Amina, Aziza, you see the difficulty. Dialogue is so important, and it's a tool that I encourage you to use as often as you can. Dialogue not only characterizes the speaker, the person speaking the dialogue, but it also characterizes the narration of the story, which in this case is Lilia. It's not always a named narrator, but stories are told with bias, and it's important for us to recognize that what is being chosen to be included is a choice, right? It's something that we need to be paying attention to. It teaches us about perspective. It teaches us about who is making those choices. And so in this case, we're also learning about Mr. Pirzada's personality. He's making a joke about his daughters, but we learned at the beginning of the paragraph that he doesn't even know if they are alive. So these jokes kind of continue, and they are all examples of irony. An ironic joke is when you're making light out of something that is very dark. And so here he is making a joke about his daughters when he doesn't know if they're alive. The very next sentence, we have more irony in the next paragraph. Each week, Mr. Pirzada wrote letters to his wife and sent comic books to each of his 7 daughters. He has a personality. He enjoys humor. And right in that sentence, the postal system, along with most everything else in Dhaka, has collapsed. And so we're able to see that as a contrast just within that sentence, right? He wants to reach his family with humor and amusement, and he can't because the basic functions of society are falling apart there. He had not heard word from them in over 6 months. Mr. Pirzada, meanwhile, that meanwhile is a really important time signifier, and as I told you, we're building setting. That includes building time, and I want us to be thinking about how time and space are functioning together. So meanwhile is saying at the same time, but in another place, focusing on another subject meaning the person who is performing the actions. Mr. Pirzada was in America for the year, for he had been awarded a grant from the government of Pakistan to study the foliage of New England. In spring and summer, he had gathered data in Vermont and Maine, and in autumn he moved to a university north of Boston, where we lived, to write short books about his discoveries. we're paying attention, right, to how we're building setting. This is a place where we are really grounded in where we are. Lahiri could have chosen to say, like, could have chosen to, like, mask where they were. I mean, we're not getting the name of the university, we're not getting the name of the town even, but we are getting the region. We know it's near Boston, and that is specific enough rather than, like, all of America, like a small town in America where there is a university. I think would be really hard for us to feel grounded in the experiences that Lilia and this family is going through during this story. But because space is so important, and Dhaka is our other space that we're in this story, I think it's important that we have kind of Boston or north of Boston to keep us grounded in this space. The story has so much to do with contrasts that we need to be grounded in those contrasts. And in this case, the two localities are far apart, and they are meant to be in contrast with one another. Mr. Pirzada lived in a room in a graduate dormitory and did not own a proper stove or television set, and so he came to our house to eat dinner and watch the evening news. At first, I knew nothing of the reason for his visits. I was 10 years old and was not surprised that my parents, who were from India, note that India is not where Mr. Pirzada is from, and had a number of Indian acquaintances at the university, should ask Mr. Pirzada to share our meals. It was a small campus with narrow brick walkways and white pillared buildings located on the fringes of what seemed to be an even smaller town. Remember, she's not naming the town, but we know the area that we're in. And then we get a list. The supermarket did not carry mustard oil. Doctors did not make house calls. Neighbors never dropped by without an invitation. And of these things, every so often, my parents complained. So lists, as I said, are really important in this story and Lahiri's style of writing this story because they replace summaries. So here is a time when Lahiri could have said, there are a lot of differences between this town and India. We find out later it's Calcutta. But instead of just brushing past that, we learn about India without by what Boston does not have. That's the same as India, or this town north of Boston does not have. And I think it's also important for us as a set, like a question that I'm going to pose that I want you to think about as we read the rest of the story. Are these customs more important to Lilia's family, Lilia's parents, than their identity with their nation state of origin? Because their nation state of origin is India, but those things weren't named. Like, her parents aren't complaining that they're not in India. Her parents are complaining that those norms, those cultural norms of India are not present here. In search of compatriots, so people who are from your place of origin now that you are all elsewhere, they used to trail their fingers at the start of each new semester through the columns of the university directory, circling surnames familiar to their part of the world. And that's what I want you to see again, is that they're not focused on finding other Indians living in America. They are focused on finding people from their region who are living in America. And in this case, that included East Pakistan and probably West Pakistan too, that region.